Hello again, degenerates, degeneritas, and esteemed members of the Degenerati, and welcome back to the MMA RAXPOD. This time for UFC 306, or as the government name dictates, Riyadh Season Noche UFC O'Malley versus Dvalishvili. That's a mouthful. I couldn't even get it out right the first time. I'm just going to call it UFC 306 because I'm not preoccupied with the sponsors or the revenue for this event like some people might be, as they're still trying to sell tickets that have dropped from an average price of, $3,000 down to $500. So if you're in Vegas, you can get a discount show at the Sphere, and I highly recommend you do that because Mr. Dana said they're not going to do another one, and based on the production cost for this event combined with the dropping ticket prices, you can probably guess why that is. There's so much going on with this event. I'm not just talking about the main event, obviously, which is, one of the most anticipated title fights of the year, I think, for sure. But also just the conflicting themes. I mean, again, this is supposed to be a featured Mexican Independence Day thing, and the main event doesn't actually feature a fighter from Mexico. Granted, the co-main event does with Alexa Grasso, but you've got all this anticipation of the Sphere being the star of the show, and they're going to be they're telling the story of Mexican combat sports through movies up on the screen between every event. You wonder how that is going to translate to the audience at home versus, the audience that's actually at the Sphere. I don't anticipate the financials being very good for this event. And that was something that I think was very apparent when Mr. Dana said that they weren't going to do another show after this. And you look at the falling ticket prices combined with the fact that they said if any fighter pulls out, that's like it's $2 million or something for each of them to get the video production required to put their stuff up on the screen and whatever. So they can't afford any cancellations or fighters to miss weight. They already had one late pullout in the form of whoever Édgar Cháirez was supposed to fight before Josh Van stepped in on short notice. So this just doesn't feel good in terms of all the comings and goings, and it just feels like they're kind of all over the place for this. I'm not super hating on the card the way that I think a lot of, maybe not a lot, but some others have been this week. I will say that from top to bottom, it feels like they could do better just for a pay-per-view. I do question some of the bout order. I think it's ridiculous that Luis Rodriguez Ode Osbourne is on the main card and Ignacio Bahamondes Manuel Torres isn't. It's also surprising that the very first fight is Raul Rosas Jr., who I saw on the main card at UFC 287. So it's, there's just a lot going on here that just causing a lot of noise, and I think that the focus is kind of all over the place, and I wonder how effective this pay-per-view is going to be. If the main event ends up being spectacular, a fight of the year candidate, then I don't think a lot of people are going to complain, which is usually the case with how most of these pay-per-views go. You're tuning in for the main event. But as far as pay-per-view standards go, it does feel like there's something from top to bottom that is leaving a little bit desired. So I've got 7 picks for this event, which is less than I have than usual. But again, there's more than a few fights between female fighters on this card, and the card itself is a little bit thin. I believe there's only 10 fights total, and 3 of them are women's fights. So eventually I'm going to get to the point where I am going to actually be putting out picks on women's fights. I recently completed my my database for 1,000 UFC fighters going back to, I think, the last 2 that I put in other than I made McGregor my 1,000th just as, kind of a cheeky little joke to myself. But the last two that I added were actually Lyoto Machida and Vitor Belfort for their fight they had in either 2017 or 18. So that's as far back as I have in terms of fighters that I've put in for their statistics. And I tried to put in only fighters that competed in the UFC at least twice to give a little bit more stability to the overall statistics. So I have a statistically significant average profile now of 1,000 fighters going back to UFC. I think the last pay-per-view that I put in was 224 in terms of how far back the fighters go. So going back to 2017 or 18, and I did compile all those statistics together to get a kind of an average baseline sense of what the average UFC fighter is capable of. I thought about putting out like the ultimate average fighter profile, if you will, on Twitter, but I think I might keep most of that information to myself just for now, because I think I might want to write about it someday and put it in a more published capacity. But this is still stuff that I'm sure other people have compiled and perhaps put out elsewhere before, so it's not like it's groundbreaking information or anything. But for the sake of me having my own examination of what the average UFC fighter is capable of, that's useful when comparing it to fighters that may be coming in with a smaller sample that have only maybe fought for a round, comparing their data to what the average is and seeing if they're going to be able to stack up. If you're going to be considering betting them as a favorite, how would they do against the average UFC fighter? Vice versa, if they're an underdog, how did their numbers stack up to what an average UFC fighter would be capable of putting out on them? So I think I will when I get to the main event, just for the sense of giving numerical understanding to how good both Sean O'Malley and Merab Dvalishvili are in their respective approaches relative to the average UFC fighter. I think I will give you a bit of a glimpse in terms of how some of their stats compare to the average, just so you get an idea of where they are at, how far they are along in their careers with respect to their skill sets. But yeah, I did want to just give you guys a quick glimpse into that I've finished finally compiling all that data. I had to manually do it. I didn't actually do any data scraping. And the next stage for me is to actually learn web scraping so that I can build a similar profile of women's fighters, and do that hopefully much faster than it took me to complete this for male fighters in the UFC. Because I didn't do it every single day, but I did start in 2022, and I got the entire active roster of men's fighters and then had to start going back historically. And it took me over 2 years to finally put that all together and manually pull all that data out. So it was a lot of hours I sank into doing that. And I would like to make my work ideally more efficient before I build it for the women's database and learn how to do that. So I'm not quite at the stage yet where I'm ready to start putting out picks on women's fights, but I am letting you know now that I will start working towards that in the near future. And ideally before, we get this platform up in, 5 years or so, where I'm actually putting out written analysis about pretty much every fight that I can, I will have already started putting out women's picks. So you have that to look forward to in the near future. It's a pretty long intro for the fact that I was considering not really recapping last week's event, UFC Vegas 97. I think the only significant misses I really had, again, I write off every underdog pick that doesn't go through. Plus money's plus money. So no sense in really looking too much into Yi Zha's let-up performance against Gabriel Santos, who many were calling the best 0-2 fighter in the UFC. And I think he kind of vindicated the stance that people took on that. Trevor Peek, that was kind of a pick 'em the whole week. He kind of floated out to minus 130 at one point, which is, I think, the price that I put him out at. I noticed after the fight started, the line had actually flipped, and Yanal Ashmouz had actually become the favorite. So enough money came in on him to do that. So not really counting that as a and I acknowledged, if you watch the the minute to win it breakdown that I gave on that fight, that Ashmouz, we weren't really fully sure what he was capable of based on his numbers, just because there was, he broke his hand in his fight against Chris Duncan, and his fight against Sam Patterson lasted, I don't even think, 2 minutes, and he was fighting someone that needed to move up to welterweight and just didn't have the chin for a lower weight class, similar to Dan Hooker going to featherweight, if you will. So I'm not really, I don't think there's any losses significant to Vegas 97 that would be worth recapping. The one thing I do want to just harken back to was from the event that happened before we had the break and before UFC Vegas 97, was the event that cost, or the fight rather, that cost me a winning night at UFC Vegas 96. And I just want to bring this up real quick for the sake of helping people that are, betting on fights or handicapping fights understand the importance of recognizing when you've been, screwed over by the judges, or when you've actually made a mistake in your analysis that merits correcting, or when you're just a victim of circumstance. And it's important because not only, I think in most cases, especially when you're publicly handicapping fights like this, it's easy for people to say, oh, you're just making excuses because your pick didn't hit or whatever. And nobody said that relative to the losing night that I had at Vegas 96. But I think just for the long-term benefit of, the importance of recognizing when a loss is a mistake that you made versus something that is just an anomaly, it's important for that not letting that affect your confidence. Because I think in the immediate aftermath, I had a better reaction to it than I did, kind of taking a long-term break. And hindsight is 20/20, because I should have gone with my plan for the 3-leg parlay last week. I would have doubled up on it, just because I only had 5 picks, and I would have had a much more. I would have won a pretty decent amount of units if I had actually gone through and doing that. But instead, I decided to stay off the event, which isn't a problem in itself, but that's something like the 3rd or 4th event this year. I think they've all been Apex events that I just opted to say it's not worth it. And I think losing the last event in the way that I did factored into that in a way that I didn't really anticipate it happening in the immediate aftermath. Now, what I'm referring to is the fight between Neil Magny and Michael Morales, in which I took the +2.5. And Magny overs have been very kind to me in the past. I have missed on them before. I took the over when he fought Shavkat Rakhmonov, and unfortunately Magny very nearly made it to the end of the second round, but just couldn't quite defend himself effectively when he got put on the ground by Shavkat, and he was able to get a submission, I think, in the dying seconds of the second round, where if he had been able to get to the third, recover in his corner and whatnot, you wonder if he could have gone an extra 2.5 minutes and made it the distance. So that was unfortunate in that case, but in pretty much every other circumstance I've taken a Magny over, it's been a very, very good bet. And this was another case where I thought he was just going to be able to write it out, because Morales, I thought his finishes deserve some context. And I think even this one deserves some context too, in terms of, how special it was for him, but then also how, like I said, you have to recognize when you've made a bad read versus when you're just a victim of circumstance. And if you are a statistically based evaluator of fights, as I think sports fans should associate stats into their analysis for any athletic event, you should probably, I would highly recommend reading Fightnomics by Reed Kuhn, who's one of the best analysts I think in this space, has been attached at the hip with MMA Odds Breaker for a very long time. Some people have said this book is a little bit out of date. I will say, since it came out in something like 2013, I can see it's been over 10 years at this point, so a lot of the data probably deserves reassessing with how the sport has evolved. But this is one of the only statistically significant collections of data surrounding the UFC with insights that draw from a statistically significant data set that you can find. So I would highly recommend picking this up and reading it if you haven't already. As you can see, I've got tons of sticky notes littered throughout this thing. But the reason that I didn't let that Magny Morales result get to me is because, I talked about how on Twitter in the immediate aftermath, the strike that led to the knockdown that led to Magny getting finished was a spinning back elbow from the clinch, which is one of the most anomalous strikes that you can witness in any UFC event. And that's backed up by the data that is in this book. So just to give you a quick sense of, first of all, in terms of the clinch is the rarest position to see a knockout in the UFC period. Most of them happen at distance. Strikes that, like power strikes that are landed on the ground, are 2 times as accurate as power strikes that are landed at distance. So you see a lot of knockouts that happen from ground and pound sequences. Clinch, like on a clinch break or just in the clinch straight up, is the rarest area to find finishes in the UFC. And that's reflected by the fact that from 2008 to 2013, there was 1 knockout from an elbow landed in the clinch in the UFC period. Now, granted, that's a 5-year sample from over 10 years ago at this point, but that gives you a sense of how rare it was to see the same kind of strike that led to Magny's downfall result in a fight ending straight up. Now, that wasn't how Magny lost. Magny lost from a grounded pound sequence, but the catalyst for that sequence was a knockdown resulting from a clinch strike that was an elbow. And if you look at the clinch knockdown rate for all weight classes, the average in the UFC is 1.6%. 1.6% of all strikes landed in the clinch will lead to a knockdown. Significant strikes, not total strikes, significant strikes landed in the clinch. That's just a little over 3 in every 200. And the welterweight average is 1.6% as well, so right aligned with what the UFC average is, based on the data that we had from 2008 to 2013. 3 in every 200, and that one spinning elbow that Morales hit that caught the top of Magny's head led to the fight-ending sequence, caused the knockdown on Magny that ruined the plus 2.5. After Magny spent the majority of the round having Morales controlled, pressed up against the fence, and Morales even admitted in his post-fight interview that Magny was, stronger than he thought he was going to be going in. So you wonder if he isn't able to get that spinning back elbow that clips the top of Magny's head, how much more of that fight was going to be spent in the clinch, and just how much more Magny would have had his wits about him, or even if he could have survived to the end of the first round after getting hit. So as soon as it hit, before Magny even got finished, I immediately knew, wow, that's just, I just got pretty badly victimized by circumstance. So it's important to educate yourself about these things so that you know when, you've actually made a mistake in evaluating fight IQ for either side versus when something crazy just happens, because it's mixed martial arts and these things can take place. So just wanted to give you that quick history lesson before we go into the UFC 306 picks. So thank you very much for bearing with me up to this point, because it's been almost 20 minutes, but we are going to get into the picks now. And I am going to try to keep this under an hour and a half, because we've only got 7, and I know a lot of these have gone long of late, but I've had a lot more fights to discuss on the last few pay-per-views than I do on this one. So we'll keep it quick, and we will start with Raul Rosas Jr. versus Aoriqileng. El Nino Problema. Shouldn't it be El Nino Problemo? I don't know. Raul Rosas Jr. enters 9-1-0 after submitting Ricky Turcios in just inside the first half of his last fight at UFC Fight Night, Cannonier Imavov. I believe he was something like a minus 300 favorite over Turcios in a fight that he pretty much dominated. It was kind of, I think Turcios might have ignored a glove touch, or I know he was just kind of like openly cursing out Rosas in that matchup, which was kind of ridiculous. At the same time, I thought it was kind of crazy that he was priced at what he was, given the fact that he pulled out for whatever reason from the last Mexican-themed fight night earlier this year that was in Mexico City. In any event, Raul Rosas Jr. won that fight. He's now 9-1 on a 2-fight winning streak. That was his only fight he's had this year. The only appearance he had prior to that was at the last Noche UFC, where he knocked out Terrence Mitchell in less than a minute. I had the under 1.5 rounds in that one, and I believe the tweet that I gave in terms of recapping the fight was holy fucking shit. So, yeah, I would recommend going back and watching that knockout if you haven't. And Raul Rosas, his striking still has a long ways to go, which is reflected in the stats. But that was an impressive result for him nonetheless to get that finish inside of a minute. Aoriqileng, conversely, his only appearance earlier this year was at Fight Night Hermansen-Pfeiffer. And this was, frankly, an embarrassing result for him. He fought Daniel Marcos. I made Daniel Marcos a parlay leg. Marcos was just absolutely teeing off on him, really getting the better of him. And there was a very awkward sequence, I believe, relative to groin kicks, where the two of them kicked each other in the groin, something like... It was dueling banjos, but with groin kicks, really. Like, they got out of one stoppage, and then I believe one of them immediately kicked the other in the groin. And then Marcos, I think, got Aoriqileng in the groin again. And it resulted in Aoriqileng kind of taking the easy way out and saying he didn't want to continue. Aoriqileng really wasn't competing much in that fight, and it ended up being a no contest, and so he didn't end up suffering a loss that he otherwise probably would have. However, he's had a handful of decent performances in the UFC since then. Not the knockout of Cameron Else, I think, was somewhat impressive. He fought Jay Perrin. I believe he was a pretty healthy favorite in that matchup, which prompted me to take the plus 2.5 rounds, given his wealth of fights that have gone the distance, and that ended up being the correct read. That was at UFC 278. I believe he was an underdog against Ayman Zahabi, and Zahabi became the first fighter to knock him out. That was really, I think, the most impressive result for Zahabi in his UFC career prior to him getting the upset over Yavid Basharat earlier this year. And then I believe Aoriqileng was in a fight that was close to a pick'em, the underdog against Johnny Munoz. I opted to play Munoz. That was in October of last year when he, at Fight Night, Dawson versus Green. And I was feeling pretty good about Munoz after how the first round went, but Aoriqileng was able to turn it around on him in the final 10 minutes in what was a pretty bona fide striker versus grappler matchup. The striker got the better of him down the stretch the final 10 minutes, and Munoz kind of just did the guard goblin routine, and despite having a really effective first round, wasn't able to implement his game plan over the last 2 rounds to get the decision win there. Now, I do think that the last result that Aoriqileng had is a big part of the reason why the line is sitting at what it's currently at, because Raul Rosas being minus 800, given the lack of development we've really seen in the striking outside of the Terrence Mitchell fight, is, I think, frankly, absolutely ridiculous. I'm even seeing him at one book, he's out to minus 1150, which is absolutely crazy to me. I know the hype around this guy is absolutely insane because I witnessed it at UFC 287, and I even made him a parlay leg that night when he fought Christian Rodriguez, and that ended up costing me a very, very profitable event, what otherwise would have been a profitable event. And he got the better of Christian Rodriguez in the first round and was able to nearly submit him, but Rodriguez had enough submission defense that Raul Rosas, because he was doing things like jumping on the back and aggressively, squeezing, trying to get the finish, tired himself out after the first 5 minutes and created a situation where Rodriguez was able to just kind of give him a vet lesson over the last 10 because Rosas wanted nothing to do with the striking and was just kind of lazily shooting from distance. I'm not saying Aoriqileng is as good of a well-rounded fighter as Christian Rodriguez is, but I do think that he demonstrated in the Johnny Munoz fight, and bear in mind, Johnny Munoz, his entire, the best part of his skill set is very much his grappling. I'm not quite sure what his credentials are for grappling, but I know that he's been a very successful grappler outside of MMA, and even he wasn't able to submit Aoriqileng despite having pretty firm back control and good position for the first 5 minutes of their fight where he was able to win the first round. And Aoriqileng hasn't been submitted in his last 25 appearances in his MMA career. He has been submitted 3 times, but those were all very early in his career, and they were all to rear naked chokes. So, which is, it's the most common submission that there is. So it appears at least that he has trained his submission defense up somewhat since he was fighting in those matches that were now 7 years ago when he was only 24 years old. He's at 31 years old in his prime age, and he's got enough experience now that I think he's trained his submission defense up to where he was able to avoid getting submitted by Munoz. Now, it's possible with the athleticism and size that Rosas Jr. possesses at bantamweight that he's just kind of able to overwhelm him early, and that's what I think a lot of the price here on his money line is implying is going to happen. But based on the fact that Aoriqileng has such a rich history of not just in the UFC, but also in his career of going the distance, he's done it 19 times in... I'm not sure, 36 total appearances, over half of them have gone the distance. So I have to imagine that if Rosas Jr. isn't able to get a submission on him in the first round, there is potentially a situation here where Aoriqileng is once again able to take, where Rosas Jr. gasses a little bit, and Aoriqileng is able to keep the fight standing and take advantage of him as the far more polished striker on the feet. You simply cannot bet a fighter at this price that just absolutely does not have the striking upside. It's a very, very irresponsible decision, despite the fact that Rosas Jr. has got a very, very clear path to victory. He hasn't proven he's able to implement that over a 15-minute fight. He had a good Contender Series appearance, but again, that was against arguably the lowest level of competition that he's had to this point. Now, he is young enough that he's probably rapidly making improvements to his skill set, but again, we've been saying that since he got in the UFC, and we still haven't seen it relative to the striking. So I think that I'm going to be banking on Aoriqileng's submission defense here to hold up. And even though I expect Raul Rosas to eventually wear Aoriqileng out and perhaps get a finish in the second half of the fight, I think that Aoriqileng is going to survive to the midway point just based on how prolific his experience going the distance is. And so because the plus 1.5 rounds here is at plus money, I'm going to be taking a shot on that. When I put the pick out, it was in the plus 125 range, and it has since come down to plus 110. But again, for just strictly looking at their UFC events, 7 of 12 have gone over the halfway point for both Raul Rosas and Aoriqileng. And that, to me, reads as, you know what, this is a good shot at plus money here. I won't sweat it if Raul Rosas Jr. ends up getting a submission in the first round, but I think it happens in the second half of the fight as opposed to early. And Aoriqileng, I think, is being disrespected here because of the quit, so to speak, that he showed against Daniel Marcos, who was a far more sophisticated striker than what Raul Rosas Jr. has demonstrated. I think Aoriqileng probably recognizes that if he doesn't get put away on the ground in the first round, he's going to have a very, very good shot to kind of outlast the gas tank of Rosas and get the better of him on the feet over the final 10 minutes. So I'm going to take Raul Rosas Jr. to win by third round submission, but I won't be surprised if Aoriqileng hasn't gone away after the first round and gets himself back into the fight and ends up winning a 29-28 in what's a massive spoiler upset. But give me the plus 1.5 rounds and at plus money. And, the one last thing that I'll say real quick about this is that this actually reminds me of a fight that happened at, I believe, the last UFC Noche, although there was a bit of a role reversal involved. It was Tatsuro Taira versus Édgar Cháirez, and Taira was something like a minus 1,100 favorite, I think, against Cháirez. And it's funny because in that case, it was the Asian fighter was the substantial favorite over the Mexican fighter. In this case now, it is the Mexican fighter that is a substantial favorite over the Asian fighter. And in that situation, I said, for as good as Taira's submission game is, I don't think he's going to be able to get the better of Cháirez, and that Cháirez survives to the halfway point. The plus 1.5 was available at plus money, and I took it. And that's the same thing I'm going to be doing here for the exact same reasons as that fight. So I'm optimistic about how this one is going to work out. I do think Rosas Jr. is able to get the late finish. But again, Aoriqileng, I think, is being disrespected on this line, and you should proceed with caution if you're going to be siding with the favorite in this one. Speaking of Édgar Cháirez, the next fight is Joshua Van and Édgar Cháirez. Joshua Van enters 10-2, having suffered his second career loss at Fight Night Namajunas Cortez. Got knocked out in the early stages of the third round in a fight that was extremely close. I remember there was some interesting interpretations of the scorecards that came out after the fact, but because of the knockdown that Johnson earned just by coming out guns blazing in the third round, even if that fight had gone to decision and hadn't been, some people thought it might have been stopped early or wanted to see them at least give Van the opportunity to defend himself. Regardless, Van would have needed to absolutely just totally overwhelm Johnson in order to actually get a win there. That was a pretty devastating result for me because I had an extremely good night otherwise at Fight Night Namajunas Cortez, UFC Denver, where I picked just about every other fight short of Ange Lusa versus the name is eluding me right now. I believe it's Gabriel Bonfim. I took Lusa as like a plus 300 underdog, and that was from that streak up to like UFC 304 where I went 9-1 picking underdogs, and I had three other underdog picks I put out that night that successfully cashed. I would have had one of my best events of the year, if not the best event of the year, had Joshua Van been able to get it done. So I have to be wary about picking him in this spot against Cháirez, who enters 11-5, finally got that elusive win over Daniel Lacerda at Fight Night Moreno Raval 2 at UFC Mexico City earlier this year. He had fought Lacerda at Noche UFC and won, but was disrespectfully, I think, given a no contest in a fight that I sympathize with Chris Tognoni, which is not something I say very often, but Lacerda kind of put him in an impossible position in terms of going limp in a choke and not really demonstrating that he still had his wits about him, even though there's people that'll say you got to go, you got to stay loose and limp in order to, that's how you defend the choke. The refs are looking for signs of consciousness, and when you just kind of, hang your arm out there like this, it's not a good indicator to the judges that you're still with it, or to the ref that you're still with it. So I very much sympathize with Cháirez there, because I think he probably should have gotten a standing guillotine, but he ended up getting an even more impressive triangle submission win against Lacerda because he got that one back. Prior to that, he lost a unanimous decision at UFC 290 at the in the aforementioned Tatsuro Taira fight that I talked about at the end of the last breakdown. So again, it's interesting that this fight presents, I think, a very similar challenge to the one that Van was going to presumably face against Charles Johnson, where Johnson is huge for the flyweight weight class, and but doesn't necessarily have the best history going the distance. But Johnson, to his credit, it seems like his cardio has improved since he got to the UFC. Obviously, he was able to get the decision win over Jake Hadley, and then had enough left in the tank despite, I think, losing the second round against Joshua Van, where the fight should have been 1-1 going into the third. Johnson was able to come out of the corner in the third and really, really just go guns blazing and overwhelm Van, get a knockdown, and then that led to a fight finishing sequence. So I don't think Cháirez has demonstrated he's got the same improvements to his gas tank that Van does. He did win the third round against Taira, if you'll recall, in unanimous fashion, just because he was able to kind of get a sneaky guillotine within the final 30 seconds that Taira was able to survive. But because it was a close attempt to finishing the fight, he got unanimously rewarded by the judges for it in a fight that Taira otherwise would have won 30-27. So he did technically win the third round in that circumstance, but it's important to recognize, why he did in that case. The problem is Cháirez, otherwise, in the other two fights he's had that have gone the distance, has not demonstrated a good gas tank at all. His first fight that went to unanimous decision in 2019, he lost to a pretty low-level opponent. And then if you watch his Contender Series fight, which I did prior to putting out my pick on this, you'll notice that he had a lot of success in the first round, that he won the first round in unanimous fashion, but started to fade a bit in the second, and then by the third round really just did not have enough left and really allowed Clayton Carpenter, who we haven't seen fight in the we've only seen fight once since that win on Contender Series and hasn't fought this year at all. He allowed Clayton Carpenter to get back into that fight and really tire him out and win a unanimous decision. Now, Carpenter, I think, has demonstrated a much more well-rounded skill set than Van has in terms of commitment to takedowns. And the big problem that Cháirez has had in his UFC fights is he's been too willing to fight off of his back and hasn't shown enough urgency to get back to his feet. I don't know if Van is necessarily going to be able to take advantage of that, but the consistent theme that we have seen with Cháirez is that he'll start strong very early and then just kind of fade as the fight goes on if he's not able to dispatch his opponent pretty quickly. You wonder how much of that is tied to the ridiculous weight cut that he has for making 125. If you'll recall, in the second fight against Daniel Lacerda, he actually missed weight by, I believe, 5 full pounds. He weighed in at 131 for a fight that was supposed to be at 125 pounds, which is an egregiously terrible weight miss The only reason that fight didn't get canceled at that point was because it's like, this is the third time we've rebooked this and we're not going to do it again. So just get out there and we'll call it a 130 catch weight and we'll just see what happens. So I think that definitely deserves context for, his last fight with Lacerda that actually did end up being the legitimate result. But you wonder how much the weight cut affects Cháirez in terms of his ability to perform past the first round. Regardless, that kind of approach where it's you see that he doesn't have much after the first round, and you saw against Tyra he was just way too willing to jump guillotine and then didn't really show great urgency to get back to his feet. That plays directly into Joshua Van's preferred method he's shown in the UFC, which is, I'm going to spend the first round making the reads that I need to get inside, particularly because I'm a smaller flyweight that is going to often be facing a reach disadvantage. And in this case, he's facing another significant one here. And I'm just going to, I talked about at the end of the last podcast how I hate using the cliches like he's got that dog in him or that he's downloading the data. But he really does have the similar thing with Peter Yan in terms of just kind of taking the first round off and then really trying to sell out for winning the last 2 rounds in order to get a decision. And hasn't really come into his power yet and only 22 years old. But Cháirez doesn't have great power either. He's got really good kicks, but he doesn't necessarily have the power that I think is going to be able to put Van out in the same way that we've kind of seen Johnson come into it lately with him getting knockdowns in not only his fight against Jake Hadley, but also now against Joshua Van that ended up making the difference for him in both of those cases. So I remain unconvinced in terms of Cháirez's, striking ability further than just his ability to throw out good kicks with how long he is. There's a lot of fighters on this card that don't necessarily make the most of the size advantages they have at their weight class that is causing me to be in a position where I'm tempted to fade them. The striking differential here is also pretty extreme. Cháirez has a -1 relative to the +1 paired with the very, very high amount of volume that Joshua Van lands. So I think Van recognizes or will recognize Cháirez's difficulty with going the distance and probably takes advantage of that here, where he's the fresher fighter after the first round, very much so after the second round, and has made enough intelligent reads at that point that he's able to get inside on Cháirez's reach advantage and just kind of pour on the volume and get a pretty resounding 29-28 decision, even on short notice. So this is he's priced pretty similarly to what he was against Charles Johnson. I still felt good about Van's prospects coming into that final round where I thought it was 1-1, even though the scorecards didn't necessarily agree. But I don't expect, if this fight gets to the third round, I don't think Cháirez is going to come out guns blazing with, the kind of knockdown ability to jump on Van in the way that Johnson did in Van's last appearance. So I'll say Josh Van wins a 29-28 decision. It wouldn't surprise me if he shows a little bit more urgency in the first round and is actually able to take that from Cháirez, just because Cháirez has been too willing to try to jump on a choke or a guillotine. And Van's been submitted before, but I do think that he will probably be hip to the somewhat limited weapons that Cháirez has demonstrated thus far, despite the physical gifts that he has for this weight class. So I don't think it's going to be a sweep for the Mexicans at Noche UFC. Give me Joshua Van to win by unanimous decision. The next fight is Ignacio Bahamondes and Manuel El Loco Torres. Bahamondes enters 15-5 after arguably the most impressive result he's had in his UFC career so far, with a first-round head kick knockout win over Christos Giagos at UFC Fight Night Alan Curtis 2. That night, I took I believe it was a +1.5 for Giagos Bahamondes, because Bahamondes did not have a single result in the UFC, or really since 2018, of a fight ending in the first half. Of course, that was exactly what happened against Christos Giagos, who perhaps I should have anticipated didn't have the chin to go that far with Bahamondes. But again, it was a head kick. It wasn't like it was a one-punch lights-out strike or anything. So it was just a great result for Bahamondes, to the unfortunate lack of benefit of myself. Fighter I've been much more successful with reads on. Manuel Torres enters 15-2. Last fought at that Mexico City fight night back in February, where he got his first UFC submission win, despite the fact that coming into the UFC he actually had 3 straight wins by submission. Got a rear naked choke over Chris Duncan, and the guy hasn't had a single fight last longer than 3.5 minutes since he got into the UFC. So Torres has had a pretty stellar run here, and his unders have been free money. That's pretty much, I don't think I've bet a Manuel Torres money line yet. I might have against Frank Camacho, but I can't remember what the price was. But I think even in that case, I just ended up taking the under just because it's been free money just about every time. He's been a very, very solid parlay leg for me in the 3 appearances he's had since Contender Series. So I've enjoyed watching him succeed. He's been easier to read for me than Bahamondes has. I don't actually think I've gotten a single Bahamondes fight correct since he got in, which is funny because he was actually one of the first fighters that I ever evaluated, because he fought at that Fight Night Makhachev Green, the first event I ever graded back in February of 2022. I took Rong Zhu to beat Ignacio Bahamondes, and that fight was a blowout. So that was one of the things, just going back, I was kind of feeling myself because I had my earlier underdog picks from that event. I took Terrence McKinney over Fares Ayam, and I also had Gregory Rodriguez over Armen Petrosian, so I was kind of feeling myself up to that point. And then the Rong Zhu Bahamondes fight was just a total wash. And I said, okay, maybe I have, more lessons to learn and a bit more to go here than just, feeling pretty good about this first event, which didn't even end up being successful for a variety of reasons. But point is, Bahamondes is someone that I graded very, very early on. I believe I took Trey Ogden to beat him. I can't quite remember. I might have taken the +2.5, but I feel like I probably took Trey Ogden just because I think that was his first fight after the Daniel Zellhuber result. And then I'm pretty sure I took Bahamondes to beat Ludovic Klein, and Klein, really got the better of him. That was probably Klein's most impressive result in the UFC so far. And then again, like I said, I took the +1.5 on that Giagos Bahamondes fight, and it just didn't really end up paying off. So I've had very good reads on Manuel Torres, easier reads to make, and Bahamondes I haven't been as successful on. So I bear that in mind when looking at these two. And Bahamondes is someone that I think is really coming into his own, but again is this one of these fighters that, despite the substantial size at lightweight, again hasn't really made the most of his physical gifts in the punching department. I believe that his 3 most recent knockouts have all been on kicks, which, for a long, lanky fighter like he is, credit to him for doing that. But I think that in terms of the pure striking, the results that Torres has had have been much more spectacular. The elbow he landed on Nicolas Mata was one of the most brutal KOs of last year. Absolutely one of the best. So I've been more impressed with Torres. I also recognize at the same time that because all of his fights have been within 1 round, that the data is probably going to be a little bit funky in terms of interpreting what he's actually capable of in a 15-minute fight. I don't expect this guy to be landing 3 takedowns, like over 1 takedown per round, the way that it's kind of shaken out for him, just because he had, I think, a couple of them against Chris Duncan. He hadn't landed a takedown in any fight, I don't think, prior to that one. So I do recognize that the numbers might be a little bit funky here, but at the same time, I think that there's a very clear path to victory for Bahamondes here, just because he's got substantially more experience going the distance, and we don't necessarily know how Torres's gas tank is going to pan out, just because the one fight that he had that went to decision was a split in his entire MMA career. And Bahamondes is going to be almost half a foot taller, and is going to have a significant reach advantage here of 2.5 inches. So you would think if he's able to kind of keep the fight within his preferred range and dictate the pace, he's going to have a pretty clear path to winning a decision here. But Torres is one of these guys that just pressures. Like he's not going to be afraid to come in and, I don't think, eat one to make sure that he gets one. And I think that he's going to make a Bahamondes uncomfortable in the same way that Ludovic Klein was able to in his way to getting a unanimous decision win over Bahamondes. So I really do like Torres here. I think that his finishing upside is just a little bit higher than what Bahamondes has, just because, again, it's impressive, that all of his knockouts have come by the way of the kicks, but it's much more repeatable for you to be able to finish a fight on punching strikes than it is on kicks, I think. So I think in terms of the punching prowess, you definitely have to favor Torres here. The numbers certainly say, in terms of striking differential, even though both of these guys fight at a really high volume, that Torres not only lands at a slightly higher volume while absorbing less damage, but also is landing more accurately than Bahamondes does at a nearly 12% higher clip. Bahamondes hasn't, I don't know if he's attempted any takedowns in his UFC career yet, but he certainly hasn't landed any. And both of these guys have very, very good takedown defense. So even though I don't anticipate this fight going to the floor, Manuel Torres is probably going to be able to threaten the potential for that at least better than what Bahamondes is going to be able to. The longer this fight goes, the more that I think it benefits Bahamondes. But Torres has shown you that he is a guy that is going to, really try to dictate how this fight is going to go and get into a firefight. And in pretty much every circumstance, he's been the one to come out ahead in that regard. And I don't think that that's something that Bahamondes has really had to deal with outside of Ludovic Klein in his UFC career. And when that's been the case, he's lost. It's possible it was the same thing with John Makdessi, and he ended up losing a split decision there too. And, Makdessi's a UFC veteran that I would imagine in that fight probably took a similar approach in terms of really trying to, pressure Bahamondes in a way that he wasn't really comfortable with dealing with. So neither of these guys have ever been knocked out, but I'm going to say that Manuel Torres is the first one to do it. And I think that even if this fight does go the distance, it's going to benefit Torres to have, the crowd for UFC Noche cheering him on as the Mexican in this matchup. So I think that he's probably able to make a bigger impression with the moments of success that he does have, even if Bahamondes is able to keep this fight more at range and kind of control distance than what Torres is going to need in order to win. But I'm going to say that Torres gets a knockout in I don't know if it'll happen in the first round. I'll say it happens in round 2 after he, puts a lot of pressure on Bahamondes and does a lot of damage in the first round that Bahamondes hasn't necessarily had to deal with in maybe any of his other fights other than against Ludovic Klein. But give me Manuel Torres to win by second round knockout. The first fight on the main card at UFC 306 is Ronaldo Rodriguez and Ode Osbourne. Ronaldo Rodriguez enters 16-2 after winning his UFC debut at UFC Mexico City earlier this year against Denise Bondar in a fight that was pretty close to a pick'em. Rodriguez was the slight underdog in that case, but he was able to overwhelm Bondar and find a submission in the dying seconds of the second round in that matchup. Ode Osbourne enters 12-7 on a 2-fight losing streak. Got submitted by Yafel Filho at Fight Night Tuivasa versus Tybura back in March of this year. He was also submitted by Asu Almabayev at Fight Night Sandhagen Font in August of last year, over a year ago. But prior to that, had a very, very impressive victory over Charles Johnson, a win that has aged well despite it being a split decision. I don't think it was necessarily controversial. I know probably Johnson bettors will throw a fit, but even most of the people I know that bet on Johnson actually would even concede that they thought Ode Osbourne won that fight. And I believe I took Ode to win that one as well. I also did, however, make him a parlay leg against Tyson Nam at Fight Night Vera versus Cruz that I believe was in San Diego back in August of 2022, and Osbourne just showed very, very poor fight IQ in that one. I think through just a flying knee without really setting it up, and then on his way down, Nam cracked him and knocked him out in the first round in a fight that gave Tyson Nam a bit more of a runway for his UFC career before eventually getting cut by the promotion, I think 1 or 2 fights afterwards. So it's interesting that the line is as close as it is in this one. And I was skeptical before I graded it just because I thought I was going to end up siding with Osbourne at a glance. I know Rodriguez enters younger, but I could tell that Osbourne was going to be significantly bigger than Rodriguez in this case. And I wondered if this was just a case of like, oh, are they, is this just people favoring the Mexican at Noche UFC? Overvaluing him more than perhaps they should Osbourne's success that he's had in the UFC. But looking it over a bit more, there's a few factors that I think make some more sense here. Because again, like I said, Osbourne is going to have, I think, an 8.5-inch reach advantage, maybe a 7.5-inch reach advantage here, which is extremely significant. Figures to be the more volume-heavy striker between the two of them. That's generally not a good recipe, and he's also listed as a southpaw compared to Rodriguez being orthodox. So you would think that Osbourne's going to find more success on the feet here than Rodriguez is going to be able to find, and he's also got substantially more UFC experience and a higher level of competition than what Rodriguez owns at this point. I also had to wonder why Rodriguez was on the main card here after just one UFC appearance at the Mexico City event earlier this year. I heard on another podcast, I believe it was Adam Martin that brought it up, that Rodriguez has the second most Instagram followers out of any Mexican UFC fighter, which is rather bizarre given he's only 25 years old and lost on Contender Series and is only now just having his second fight in the UFC. But again, there's Mr. Dana tends to be pretty captivated by social media metrics, if you will. So if they think that this guy might be some kind of budding Mexican star at flyweight, they probably want to prop that up. That's at least I think worth taking into consideration here, just relative to why this is on the main card and a fight like Bahamondes Torres isn't. But looking at it a bit further, I started to notice a few more things that make sense for me why Rodriguez is probably favored here. Obviously the trend of losing 2 fights in a row by submission really isn't good for Ode Osbourne. And Rodriguez is someone that has never been finished. So, and now, not only got his first UFC win by submission, but has a series of different submission wins on his record now and actually has more of them he has more submission victories and knockout victories in his MMA career than what Ode Osbourne currently has. So you have to figure that he's going to be more of a credible submission threat, despite the fact that Ode Osbourne does have a submission win on Contender Series himself, at least. But obviously the submission defense has been a bit of an issue in his UFC career. He had one of the more interesting tap outs, I think, that you'll ever see in the UFC when he fought Brian Kelleher, got put in Kelleher's signature guillotine, and as opposed to tapping with any of his hands, battered his foot on the floor like a gavel in order to indicate that he was tapping out to the guillotine. I have never seen a fighter submit with their foot before or since. So it was interesting that he felt like he was so worried about, fighting the choke with his hands, I think, that he couldn't even bother to tap out with one of his hands, which I think is kind of interesting, but not necessarily a reflection of his submission defense as much as the fact that he's now lost 3 fights in the UFC by submission. Also lost a fight inside of 30 seconds by knee bar prior to getting into the UFC. So the submission defense is something that you would hope he has worked on at least a little bit, but it's not reflected that he has based on his most recent losing streak. So I think most people are banking on Rodriguez to get takedowns here. Osbourne's takedown defense is 64%, which I think is a little bit higher than what the average fighter is capable of. So it's not substantially so. But he's also landing takedowns at nearly half of the rate that Rodriguez is, or half as efficiently as Rodriguez is. Both of them average almost identical takedowns per 15 minutes. So you would think in terms of getting this fight to the floor for a submission, Rodriguez is going to be more efficient in doing so. I think he is probably going to need to do that if he wants to win here, just because the reach and the size and the volume that Osbourne has, and also the power. The guy, I mean, both of these guys have demonstrated that they're capable of one-punch knockouts. If you're doubting that in the case of Ronaldo Rodriguez, I recommend that you go watch his fight against Paul Marquez Moreno, and you will see him knock out somebody very, very badly within the first 90 seconds of the fight starting. So Rodriguez certainly has, I think, as much power as Osbourne does. Osbourne just has the better physical tools for deploying it here, where I can understand why this fight is kind of lined as close as it is. But Osbourne's been knocked out multiple times. He's been submitted multiple times. He's clearly carrying worse attrition going into this than what Rodriguez does. And Rodriguez also has more fights that have gone the distance and a little bit better of success rate in the final round. So you have to think, even if Osbourne has early success on the feet, that Rodriguez is going to slowly be able to implement the more effective game plan down the stretch and perhaps end up getting a 29-28 decision win. And he's also got the better momentum in his career here, just generally on a 6-fight winning streak compared to Osbourne's 2-fight losing streak. And he's going to have the Mexican crowd in his favor too, supporting the success that he has if this fight does go longer. I do think this is a case where the longer the fight goes, the better I probably feel about Rodriguez, which is kind of the same thing with what happened in his fight with Bondar. Bondar was able to kind of, I think, keep it close in the early going, but then Rodriguez just kind of built and was able to end up getting that submission win in the final second, I think, of the second round. So I think that Rodriguez is going to find a submission in the second half of this fight too. So I think that he outlasts the early storm from Osbourne here, is able to eventually get the fight to the ground, probably jumps on Osbourne's back and gets a rear naked choke. So give me Ronaldo Rodriguez to win by late second round submission once again. But I won't be surprised if this fight goes the distance either, and Rodriguez is able to get a pretty clear-cut 29-28 decision victory. The next fight is Daniel Zellhuber and Esteban Ribovics. Zellhuber enters 15-1 following his unanimous decision win over Francisco Prado, a fight where he was pretty heavily favored to win, I believe. but did end up dropping the first round and kind of had to be reminded by his coaches, hey, you kind of have an enormous reach advantage here, and so you should probably just jab him to death. And he was like, oh, I do. So I will just do that. And that's exactly what he did over the last 10 minutes to get a 29-28 decision win. Ribovics, conversely, that was at also the Mexico City fight night. So there's a pretty big trend here of fighters that haven't fought since that UFC Mexico City event that are now at Noche UFC. Conversely, Ribovics last appeared at Fight Night Luis Nascimento, got one of the best knockouts of the year over Terrence McKinney. And it was interesting because Ribovics had a much bigger rep coming into that fight as kind of a pure boxer, not really someone that was kicking as much, and just absolutely put McKinney's lights out with one of the best head kicks you're going to see all year. So that was easily the most impressive result Ribovics has had in his UFC career. And it's showing the progress he's making in terms of developing more well-rounded striking, which for a guy with the kind of boxing ability that he's already demonstrated, and the power that he's already showcased, makes him a very dangerous fighter, and I think makes him a very, very live underdog in this spot in a way where the line is kind of surprisingly disrespectful. And again, there's a lot of reasons to like Zellhuber here. I think that this fight in many ways is very, very similar to the one that he just had against Francisco Prado. The difference is Prado wasn't nearly was much younger, I think younger than Zellhuber even. I think Prado was only like 21 or 22 years old. Ribovics comes into this 28. So I didn't really expect age to factor into the matchup with Zellhuber in either of these cases, given Zellhuber's 25. But the key difference, I think, is that you've got a much younger fighter out of a worse camp. I think he was at the Goat Shed, was Prado, which I think there's one other big Argentinian UFC women's fighter that fights out of there. I'm forgetting her name right now. It's the woman that twerks all the time. But in any event, Ribovics moved to Kill Cliff FC, I think, shortly after he got to the UFC, and it's obviously one of the deepest talent camps that you can be in. One that I think kind of offsets whatever improvements Zellhuber has been making himself at Extreme Couture. So I do think that Ribovics is going to be in a position here where he's very well mentally prepared for the challenge he's going to have in overcoming the size advantages that Zellhuber has coming into this. Zellhuber is going to be 3 inches taller, which is an advantage for him considering that he's going to have an 8-inch reach advantage here, which is highly significant. But I think Ribovics, given the fact that he's only got a 69-inch reach, is probably already prepared for the fact that fighting at lightweight, he's probably going to be in a situation where in most of his matchups, he's going to be facing significant reach disadvantages anyway. And what surprised me when I ran the numbers on this was that even though Zellhuber has shown a good ability to, not necessarily make the most of his reach, but at least just get a positive differential on strikes relative to the volume that he's putting out, Ribovics actually has the better differential on strikes here. And it's not like Ribovics has fought slouches either. I mean, I think his fight at UFC 285 against Loik Radzhabov might have been a short notice call-up, and he conducted himself very well there. Very nearly ended up winning that fight, actually. I think won the second round in unanimous fashion, but just wasn't able to overcome the chain wrestling. And what really made the difference, I think, was just the power that Radzhabov already had demonstrated, that he was able to kind of wobble Ribovics back in a way that kind of evened things out on the feet in the third round. It ended up getting him a 29-28. But I imagine he's learned from that fight. When he fought Kemwella Kirk, he really, really shut down Kirk over the final 10 minutes in terms of being able to get anything going on the ground, and really just kind of gave him a boxing lesson. It was really an eye-opening performance in terms of the effective volume and power striking that guy had. Then got the fight with McKinney, I think was a pretty wide favorite. I took the under on that, and that ended up cashing inside of a minute. So, I mean, that was one of the most eye-opening results of the year. And to be able to do that to a guy like McKinney, who's gotten some pretty eye-opening results of his own despite the lack of success that he's had against higher-level competition of late, was still a really impressive result. Zellhuber, I think, has rebounded very well since his the UFC debut, where he kind of became a bit of a deer in headlights against Trey Ogden. That's kind of when people talk about the fact that there might be some tentativeness when young fighters make their UFC debut. That's the most definitive result that I point to, because Zellhuber came into that fight a minus 400 favorite and hasn't had a performance like that before or since. And so those first-time octagon jitters, despite the fact that he had a great fight against Lucas Almeida, one of the best fights in the history of Contender Series, in my opinion, against Lucas Almeida, where he got a unanimous decision win, really froze up against a fighter in Ogden that we recognize as a more effective grappler than striker. But Ogden, I think, only landed 1 of 11 takedowns in that fight and didn't even get 45 seconds of control time. Ogden just kind of leg kicked his way to a decision win in a fight that Zellhuber really just never got going for whatever reason, that he was gun shy. So when you think about the risk of fighters making their UFC debut being like jittery, that's the most definitive example that sticks out to me. But he's rebounded very well since. Got the unanimous decision win over Lando Venata. Got a submission win over Christos Giagos that was very impressive. That was his first UFC submission win and only the third of his career. And then, against Prado, I made him a parlay leg. I felt pretty good about it. What I was disappointed with was that he didn't make the most of his reach advantage as immediately as I thought he was going to. He had to kind of get reminded to use his jab when he went back to his corner after a first round, where Prado, because he was pushing the pace, got the first round and then did a better job controlling the fight over the last 10 minutes and ended up getting a decision win. I think that the path for Zellhuber winning this against Ribovics is very similar. The difference is Ribovics is capable of all the same things that Prado was, but he's much more disciplined and further along in his MMA career and more experienced, and has been showcasing a more flourishing skill set than what we saw from Prado at the stage of the career that he was in. And you have to wonder if Zellhuber wasn't able to, if he makes similar mistakes to what he did against Prado here against a more disciplined, further along fighter in Ribovics, how is that going to play out for him? I will say that Zellhuber, if this fight does end up going the distance the way the Prado one does, it's probably going to end up favoring him, just because the only fight he's long lost going the distance was that bizarre result against Trey Ogden in his UFC debut. And he's won all of his other fights going the distance, and he has 3 times more experience doing so than what Ribovics does. So I still think Ribovics is going to get the better of him here, just because Ribovics has the more effective power in his hands. Zellhuber hasn't really been much of a power striker. I hesitate to call him a point fighter because he did a lot of damage to Prado, but hasn't really had any of the one-punch lights-out results that we have seen from Ribovics. And Ribovics has slowly come along in terms of diversifying his striking. I think has made more noticeable improvements with the excellent camp that he's at than what we've seen from Zellhuber at this stage. So I'm going to be backing Ribovics as an underdog here. I do think the line is pretty wide. I won't be surprised if Zellhuber ends up getting another 29-28 decision win, but I'm going to say that Ribovics jumps on Zellhuber in the first 10 minutes here, makes enough of an impression where Zellhuber probably gets the final round just because Ribovics recognizes that he's banked the first 2 rounds and that he just has to avoid getting finished, which he never has been in MMA. Neither of these guys have. And I think Zellhuber's chin holds up to where he doesn't end up taking his first knockout loss here. But I do think that Ribovics is going to fight the more effective, well-rounded MMA fight here, that he's going to do what he needs to mitigate the reach, that he's able to pressure Zellhuber in a way that he's not really comfortable, and that Zellhuber doesn't start making the most of the physical gifts that he's going to have in this matchup until it's already too late. So give me Ribovics to win a 29-28 decision. I would hope that he's actually able to get a knockout instead, but given the damage tolerance that we've seen from Zellhuber, the fact that he's never been finished, I don't think it's going to be the case. And again, I won't necessarily be surprised if Zellhuber ends up getting the decision here just because he's got more experience and success doing so. But Ribovics, I think, is a rapidly improving fighter at this stage of his career in the same way that Zellhuber is. I just think that there's more offensive there's been a better offensive impression made by Ribovics through his UFC career so far than what we've seen from Zellhuber. So give me Esteban Ribovics to win. The next fight is Diego Lopes and Brian Ortega. Lopes enters 25-6 after a chaotic event surrounding UFC 303 in which he was supposed to fight Brian Ortega on short notice. But ended up having to fight Dan Ige on 4 hours' notice, and was able to get a unanimous decision win there, a pretty clear-cut 29-28. A result that impressed me, just given all the crazy events surrounding what happened there that we'll get into in a minute. Conversely, Brian Ortega enters 16-3 after a extremely impressive comeback win over Yair Rodriguez at UFC Mexico City earlier this year. You'll recall that Ortega, in addition to the fact that this was a rematch given the bizarre way that their first fight ended, Ortega rolled his ankle while Bruce Buffer was reading the names of both fighters in the cage, and ended up giving up what was scored by, I think, at least one judge as a 10-8 round to Yair Rodriguez before coming back and getting a 10-8 round himself in the second round, and ended up Yair just, making Yair fight a fight that he didn't really want to deal with, and Yair kind of ended up quitting, which was a devastating result for me because I had a choice between taking the plus 3.5 in the main event between Moreno and Royval at the same price at what Yair Rodriguez's money line was. I decided to stick with what I thought was the more sure result in the money line. Ortega rolls his ankle in the lead up, and I'm thinking Yair's going to be able to pounce. Yair does pounce, gets a knockdown in the first round, and I'm thinking this is going very, very well for me because if Yair wins, I have an extremely profitable night on the heels of what was my best night of the year at UFC 298 when I had a clean sweep that I put out a bonus podcast for just to kind of take a victory lap after that clean sweep and thought, hey, things are finally going right. But I made the wrong decision in that case, not siding with the over between the flyweights, and it ended up costing me what could have been an otherwise very profitable night, where the only other pick I missed other than Yair versus Ortega was Victor Altamirano against Felipe Dos Santos in a fight that many people said was a bad decision for Dos Santos, which I think is reflected by the fact that Dos Santos lost Andre Lima last weekend in a fight where I took Lima. But anyway, the events surrounding UFC 303, I think really deserve revisiting here because I don't necessarily recall whatever I would have said in the breakdown on the RAXPOD for 303. I didn't listen to it back before doing this, but I did say, okay, you know what? I picked Ortega in that case. Ortega ended up pulling out. I ended up hitting one more parlay than perhaps I would otherwise if the Ortega result had taken place at UFC 303, which is part of the reason why it was, I think, my second most profitable event that I've had this year. But I said, it's really time for me to do a deep dive on Diego Lopes here, because I was ready to fade him in that spot, and he ended up winning the fight against Ige. And while I was watching the pay-per-view, I actually thought about just doing a quick spur-of-the-moment analysis grading on Ige versus Lopes, but I figured, given how wide the line was, I didn't expect Ige to win on 4 hours notice, and I figured because of the experience that Ige had and the negative differential on strikes that Lopes still has in his UFC stats, I was probably going to end up putting out Ige as a pick that I wasn't really confident in anyway. If that fight had been 5 rounds, Ige probably ended up winning because he did turn it around after the third. But even I think that deserves some context worth mentioning, because you wonder, it's really important to remember that Lopes took that original fight with Ortega on only very short notice himself. That fact gets lost in the fact that, they had to rebook Ige on 4 hours notice. And I think part of the reason they were so desperate to do that is because UFC 303 had already had a catastrophic amount of main and co-main event cancellations. Obviously McGregor, but then you also had the de-evolution of Jamal Hill versus Carlos Ulberg, ultimately turning into Anthony Smith versus Roman Dolidze, a fight that the UFC recognized, we cannot make this the co-main event for a pay-per-view, so we'll leave it on the main card, but we have to get a more prolific fight for the co-main event for this in order to salvage this event. And they did. But then Brian Ortega wasn't ready for featherweight and had to make a call to Diego Lopes's camp and say, look, I'm not going to be able to realistically make this. Can you meet me at 155 instead? And Lopes agreed. And they both weigh in at 155. And then within 24 hours, Ortega pulls out due to illness. And he said he's never done that before. And sure, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. But that raises a lot of concern for me, that they even had, that they would agree to this to begin with, and then they would recognize up front that Ortega was going to have that much issue making 145. And full credit to Lopes, who not only took that fight on short notice, then took Ige on hours notice, but you'll recall made his UFC debut taking Movsar Evloev, one of the top 5 guys in the division now, was top 10 at that point, on very short notice himself, and made as solid of an impression as you probably can debuting against a top 10 opponent like that. So in terms of, the potential for bailing or quitting or copping out or whatever, I'm not saying that Ortega is that guy, because he's proven to be unbelievably tough, and it's reflected in the most recent result that he had. But Lopes is unquestionably much more about it, I think, at this stage than Ortega is based on the most recent result that happened. I watched every single fight of Lopes's, not his 2 Fury and his Lux Fight League appearances, but I went back and I watched his Contender Series appearance against Joe Anderson Brito, and then watched his other 5 UFC fights he's had since then, because I said, okay, this is now somebody who, even though I took the plus 2.5 rounds of plus money on his fight with Evloev, and that was successful, and I took him against Gavin Tucker too, this is somebody that I faded against Pat Sabatini and faded against Sadiq Youssef. And even though I never graded his fight with Ige, I said I can already tell based on how favorable my analysis is to Ige that I would end up taking Ige in this spot, so I don't even want anything to do with it. So that is presumably a fighter I would have faded 3 times in a row that proved me wrong in every case. So I said, okay, I need to take a step back and really do a deep dive and see how has this guy improved since that Contender Series appearance where he lost to Joe Anderson Brito. What kind of improvements has he made since then? The submission offense was always there. He was too willing to fight off of his back and didn't show enough urgency getting off of his back against Joe Anderson Brito. It was something that was a further reflection of why I think he lost the fight against Movsar Evloev too. And it was still something that it was even around in the case of him fighting against Gavin Tucker, but he was benefited by the fact that Tucker hadn't fought in I think something like 2.5 years at that point. The ring rust came in, wasn't as sharp with the submissions, and even though Lopes kind of did a jumping, flying triangle to bring that fight down, and he was fighting from his back, was still able to put the triangle in a position where he was able to get the armbar and then was able to finish Gavin Tucker inside of 2 minutes. But the ground game had nothing to do with his wins over Sabatini or Yusuf. He was just a better striker in those cases. And the two biggest improvements that I think he's made relative to what I am looking at for fighters since that appearance on Contender Series are his footwork and the sophistication of the combos that he's putting out. He kind of averaged footwork against Brito. He was really kind of flat-footed in a way that I think Brito was able to capitalize on for getting inside and getting takedowns, and then that paired with the fact that Lopes was too willing to fight off of his back explains why Brito was able to get the technical decision win, despite the fact that the fight ended by eye poke only 12 seconds into the third round. And I think that kind of flat-footedness was still a bit around in his fight with Evloev, which is how Evloev was able to get in and really fight a dominant second round. Although the main reason Evloev won that fight, obviously, was because he was just a step ahead on a lot of the submission attempts. But the footwork, I think, showed up against Dan Ige, where he was a little bit lighter on the foot. You don't see a lot of stance switches from Lopes, but he was just more active in terms of keeping his feet off of the floor, both his back foot and his front foot, in a way where that kind of liveliness, stands to benefit him very much. Just, makes you a little bit more difficult to read, I think. If he were to implement that with stance switches, I think that would benefit him a lot, but not every fighter is capable of fighting out of, the opposite stance from what they're comfortable with. But my point is, you see him not carrying his feet on the floor as much as you did in his Contender Series appearance. So that's one area where he's made improvements. The other area is just the sophisticatedness of combos. I talk about a lot how, again, I'm not someone with boxing experience or really any sort of striking acumen to begin with. It'd be very difficult for me to describe to you, how to set up a jab or a double jab or a hook or an uppercut, or explain a lot of the differences on those strikes. So I don't pretend to do that. But at the same time, I think that a lot of how you can grade a fighter effectively is, a much simpler game than a lot of the people that fancy themselves technical mavens of this sport would perhaps want to admit. You can make very simple reads on fighters and their ability in different areas just by doing things like counting the number of strikes that they're able to put into a combo. It stands to reason a fighter that is capable of putting out 3 or more punches in a combo is probably going to have a better potential for fight-ending ability than someone that is only throwing 1-2s. Now, Lopes wasn't a 1-2 guy. He was throwing 3-punch combos against Joe Anderson Brito, but one of the areas you've seen him come along in since he's gotten into the UFC is more sophisticated combos, and the sequence that led to the knockout with Sadiq Yusuf was a 5-punch combo, and that really, really impressed me, especially as someone that took Yusuf as the underdog to win that matchup. Watching it back again finally, I said, okay, this is the pure evidence that this guy has really, really made strides in his striking, where now that paired with the submission offense he has makes him an exceptionally dangerous offensive fighter.
One of the other things I held against him was that he, despite, being propped up as this ground savant, he hadn't landed a takedown in his UFC career prior to the Dan Ige fight. And he finally did that in the second round of his fight with Ige, where he, I believe, caught a kick and took Ige down with it, and then was able to deploy good ground offense, finally not from his back, did a good job taking the back of Ige, and then was able to end the round in that position where he had very, very firmly banked the opening 2 rounds of the fight to where he didn't really have to worry about winning the third. He just kind of had to survive. And he did end up losing the third round to Ige, and I think that's something worth monitoring relative to his cardio in this matchup. But at the same time, you wonder how much of that was, okay, he's already been through a whole bunch of crazy stuff in terms of opponent changes and altering his weight cut, relative to what was going on with the Ortega fight, and then switching over to Ige. You wonder at this point, he knows he's got 2 rounds banked. Is he really going to try to, go balls to the wall in the third to get a finish, as opposed to just walking out of that circumstance with a secure win? So you wonder, in a situation where he's feeling more confident or necessarily needs to go out and win the third round, how much more effective he would be at doing that. We haven't necessarily seen a situation yet in the UFC where that's really been the case, but the third round against Evloev was still close, and he very nearly even won that fight with the knee bar at the end of that one. He just kind of ran out of time, even though I think Evloev was pretty handily winning the fight before that that round rather, before the final minute. But that willingness to fight off of his back that concerned me, and still kind of concerns me, wasn't there in the Ige fight. He was much better about, being the guy on top and making sure that he was winning the exchanges in space before Ige finally started to make reads in the third round and then actually ended up on top in one sequence. So I picked Ortega to win the original fight. And in addition to the circumstances I said surrounding UFC 303 and his pullout, Ortega's now in a position where he's coming in on 2 times more ring rust than what Lopes has, because Lopes still fought at UFC 303. So I would anticipate Lopes coming out and winning the first round here. Just because Ortega is so tough, I think that Ortega probably ends up making reads and getting the fight back in his favor in the third round and winning that. I think this fight is going to come down to who wins the second round. And when looking at the skill sets between these two guys, I think it's very, very evident that Lopes has the ability to defend, even though Ortega's got brutal ground and pound and obviously is one of the best submission practitioners in the UFC, and I would argue is a more proven submission ace than Lopes is, despite Lopes's own eye-opening start to his career and the record that he has in that department. I think that these two kind of not necessarily cancel each other out on the ground, but it's very, very clear, I think, at this point that Lopes offers more of a problem for Ortega in standing exchanges than vice versa. And I think that that's going to make the difference in this fight through the first 10 minutes, to where Lopes is able to get a 29-28 decision victory and just kind of has to survive, off of his back in the third round. So I'm going to say Lopes wins a 29-28 here. It would be stunning if either of these guys end up handing each other the first submission loss of their MMA careers. I think Lopes probably has the knockout upside, just because even though Ortega's only been knocked out by doctor stoppage and the weird shoulder separation injury TKO in the first fight with Yair, you just wonder if there's a little bit more attrition built in at this point, despite the fact that Lopes has been outright knocked out himself in 2 prior UFC fights. I just don't think that outside of ground and pound, Ortega is offering much on the feet to where he'd be able to get the better of Lopes in standing exchanges. So I think Ortega's going to need to go to the ground immediately if he wants to win this. Lopes's desire to fight off of his back concerns me in that regard, but I still think that Lopes is going to do what he needs to do in order to win this. and is coming in with a better momentum at this point, particularly relative to how their last fight got canceled. And because of that, I think Lopes is going to walk out with a 29-28 decision win and firmly establish himself as a title contender in the featherweight division. And now we come to the main event. Sugar Sean O'Malley and Merab Dvalishvili. O'Malley enters 18-1 after avenging the only loss of his MMA career, the injury TKO to Marlon Chito Vera, by absolutely scorching Vera in a 50-45 decision win at UFC 299. Really wasn't particularly close. Sean O'Malley was like 2.5 to 1 favorite. I put him out pretty confidently as a favorite in that matchup, and he vindicated that result. Would have had a winning night at 299 if Jailton Almeida didn't eat a flurry of hammer fists from Curtis Blades on the fence. But that's neither here or there at this point. Conversely, Dvalishvili enters 17-4. Last appeared at UFC 298, Volkanovski Topuria. Fought Henry Cejudo, won a 29-28 decision in which he kind of stunningly dropped the first round to Cejudo, despite being a pretty significant favorite over the former champ. I took the plus 2.5 in that case, which was lined at something like minus 300, but I figured, there's absolutely no reason based on Dvalishvili's tendency to go the distance and weaponize his cardio to the fullest extent that makes me believe that Cejudo is going to be able to finish him, or that Dvalishvili is going to be even remotely interested in fighting or finding a finish on Cejudo, which was further reflected in the fact that I believe he carried Cejudo over to like Dana White and Mark Zuckerberg at one point and was just kind of showboating instead of worrying about finding a finish. So yeah, that was one element of the clean sweep that I had at UFC 298. This is a very classic striker versus grappler matchup, although the grappling, I think, of Dvalishvili deserves an asterisk, if only for the reason that he's got one submission win in his MMA career. It was an armbar at Ring of Combat in 2017 in his penultimate fight prior to joining the UFC. Doesn't have any UFC submission wins. Technically lost that submission to Ricky Simone. It's stunning that he lost the first two fights of his UFC career and has since ascended to the point that he's at now. Although I think many people would argue that he should have won those first two results against Frankie Saenz, which went to split decision. And obviously the ending to the Simone fight was controversial in its own right, and a fight that hasn't necessarily aged well for Dvalishvili. Or just the glance of the result itself relative to how far on the downslope Simone is now in his own career. But is on a 10-fight winning streak since, which is even longer than the one that Sean O'Malley is enjoying. And I just want to, in terms of giving you a sense of what, like, I talked about earlier in the show about, I have this average now in terms of what these two fighters are capable, or no, forgive me. I have this average now in terms of, what the average UFC fighter over 1,000 different examples is capable of. I just want to give you a comparison of how these two guys' skill sets stack up compared to what the average is, just so you get a sense of, how impressive it is what they've accomplished for themselves. So the average UFC fighter has a positive striking differential ever so slightly. It's really close to just about even. It's only about 0.04 significant strikes difference. So the average UFC fighter really is taking one to land one, but more often than not landing one. But the interesting thing is, They're landing significant strikes at just shy of like 4 per minute, and their accuracy, interestingly, is less than 50%. It's only about 46%. So the average fighter is landing strikes at a 46% clip and landing just shy of about 4 per minute. They defend strikes at a pretty similar rate, as I said, at about 3.89. But the defense is substantially better than defensive efficiency rather is better than the offensive efficiency, defending strikes at about 53% of incoming strikes. Now you compare that to Sean O'Malley's numbers. O'Malley lands over 7.5 significant strikes per minute, so not quite double the amount that the average UFC fighter lands, but that gives you a sense of how impressive the volume he's landing really is. And the more impressive stat is the accuracy. For the amount of volume that he's landing, O'Malley is, for his UFC career, landing at a 61% clip. O'Malley is 15% more accurate than the average UFC fighter, while landing at close to 2 times the volume. So the offensive prowess here is undeniably brilliant. And he's also defending incoming strikes at a slightly better rate than what his offensive efficiency is at 62%. So 9% better at deflecting incoming strikes and 15% better at landing his own offense while boasting that volume. One of the most impressive strikers in the UFC right now. There's no question about it. It explains how he has ascended so quickly to champion, in spite of the fact that I think he lost to Peter Yan. He's clearly gotten preferential treatment due to the star potential from the UFC, which I think is something else you need to consider in this matchup. But it explains why the guy has 7 UFC finishes and why he prides himself on the reputation he has for his striking. I don't know if I would go as far as to call him the best, but he's up there. And when you combine that with the power that he's demonstrated, he's a problem for anybody, especially with the size that he's boasting at this weight class of bantamweight. Now, what makes Merab so impressive is just the pace in terms of takedowns that this guy fights at is insane. The average UFC fighter lands 1.5 takedowns per 15 minutes at a 35% clip. That's it. 35%. So they're just over a third of the takedowns that the average fighter attempts are actually landed. Merab has a similar efficiency relative to landing takedowns, but he's landing nearly 6.5 takedowns per 15 minutes. That's over 4 times as much. 4 times as much as the average fighter in the UFC. That is just absurd. It speaks to the otherworldly gas tank that this guy has. The average fighter has about 7 fights in their MMA career that have gone the distance that makes the UFC roster. Merab's gone the distance 16 times. Their average rate of success in the final round is about 62%. Merab, it's 88%. So the guy has over twice as much experience going the distance as the average fighter. He wins his final rounds at over 25% more of an effective rate than the average fighter. And he's doing it fighting a style where he is averaging close to 18 takedown attempts and landing 6 takedowns per 15 minutes. That explains why this guy has probably the most dangerous cardio in the entire UFC. And his only finish was a very, very controversial submission loss to Ricky Simon. He's never been knocked out. But his chin has been exposed as vulnerable against fighters that, he should otherwise be dominating. And granted, he did get the only finish of his UFC career against Marlon Moraes. But Moraes was unquestionably on the downslope of his career at that point. Moraes lost his last 7 UFC or MMA appearances by knockout before retiring. The third fight in that sequence was his fight with Dvalishvili. So he already had 2 knockout losses banked on the downslope of his career prior to fighting Merab. And Moraes unquestionably won the first round against Merab by nearly finishing him in a fight where a referee, maybe a little bit stingier, might have just stopped it, given a lot of the earlier stoppages we've seen of late. But Merab was able to come back, rally, and take advantage of the fact that Moraes was, on the downslope of his own career and got a finish in his own right. But he hasn't finished any of his other fights in the UFC. It's just been straight weaponization of cardio and relentlessly trying to put the fight on the floor. If the opponent gets up, putting it back on the floor, just not letting the guy go. But even with that style, we've seen him kind of let first rounds get away from him, not just because he's taking them off, but just because some fighters do a better job of implementing their skill set earlier on than what we've seen from Dvalishvili. It just happened against Henry Cejudo in a fight where Merab was a substantial favorite. The longer this fight goes, the more that it obviously favors Merab because of the otherworldly factors I just mentioned relative to takedown volume and pace. But you can't deny here that Merab is there to be hit. And he's facing a 4-inch reach disadvantage here. He's nearly half foot shorter than O'Malley is. And O'Malley is fighting, I think, with just as much confidence as Merab has to have after avenging the only loss of his MMA career. The longer this fight goes, the more I think it favors Merab. But there's also, you have to remember that because each of these fights starts out on the feet, and we haven't really seen O'Malley get tired in any of his own fights that have gone the distance. He's got only a third of the experience going the distance that Merab does, but he's also got a 90% success rate in the third round. The only one that was even in dispute was his fight with Peter Yan. In a fight where he wasn't necessarily tired, you just had both guys doing mutual damage on each other in the final round, and you wonder how much of a difference that's going to make. The earlier stages of this fight, I think O'Malley's going to dominate. The later this fight gets, the more that it invites the possibility for Merab to wrestle his way back into it. But each one of these rounds is going to start on the feet, and that will present an opportunity every time for O'Malley to make an impression in the striking that potentially outweighs whatever Dvalishvili is able to do in terms of control. And even if this fight does go the distance, I think that presents an opportunity for O'Malley to potentially get a decision win here that he might not otherwise deserve. In the same way that he got it against Peter Yan, despite Yan landing 6 takedowns in that fight, that I thought that combined with the damage Yan did on the ground probably should have made the difference for him winning the fight. O'Malley's the cash cow here. The UFC's got very, very limited stars, I think, at this point, especially given the sudden decline that we've seen from Adesanya. It's tough, I think, to pinpoint who the definitive star in the promotion is right now. I think that especially after Izzy's win over Pereira a year ago, it would have been far-fetched to... I don't think anybody could have anticipated Pereira would ascend to being one of, if not the biggest star in the promotion that the UFC has now. It's probably still John Jones, but again, we haven't seen Jones fight since UFC 285. And of course, there's McGregor too. But I mean, are we going to ever see McGregor again at this point? Certainly not in a championship fight. It's tough to it's tough for me to see O'Malley not getting preferential treatment from the judges in a close fight if it ends up being a split decision. Maybe Merab just totally drowns him in, over 5 rounds and leaves no doubt. But I think that we've seen, particularly against Jan, we saw a good enough get-up game that Merab is not going to be able to make a big enough impression with the kind of, wearing and dragging on him with all the takedown attempts that, even if O'Malley's having trouble breaking loose from those wrestling exchanges, I still think that he's going to make enough of an impression with the striking in the earlier stages of the round that you say, well, Merab didn't really do any damage, so why would you give it to him? And this is, the one thing that ends up salvaging, I think, this whole event here is O'Malley making a statement win. And, they put O'Malley in the sphere because they wanted to have one of their biggest stars running this show. And that's what he's doing here. So again, I'm not picking O'Malley because I think the UFC is propping him up or anything, even though I think there's a pretty documented history of that. But I am saying that I think that you just have to imagine that the striking here is going to make more of an impression on the judges if it does end up going the distance than Merab just kind of doing a wall and stall routine as he had to do against Jose Aldo. Not saying O'Malley has the takedown defense that Aldo does, but we've just seen Merab lean too heavily on wrestling exchanges without doing enough effective damage in the past that you just wonder if there's an argument even to be made for O'Malley winning these close rounds with whatever striking he's able to do. Is that going to end up making the difference? I think O'Malley's going to catch Dvalishvili early. Just because Merab's too much there to be hit and his chin has shown vulnerability before. So I'm going to say that O'Malley finds a knockout early in the second round after hurting Merab early. Merab is able to kind of wear through it and take the fight down and, survive to the end of the round, but still, definitively loses the first round just because of a knockdown or whatever reason. Both fighters come out of the corner. Merab is showing urgency to get the fight on the floor and shoot takedowns. And I think O'Malley catches him with a knee similar to the one that he caught Cheeto with that the UFC commentary team said made a sound that sounded like Cheeto got hit by a baseball bat. So I think O'Malley gets a standing knee knockout finish on Merab here for Merab just shooting in too feverishly, and I'll say it happens in the second round. And that's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 306. Thank you very much for sticking around. Please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. The Minute to Win It breakdowns have been quite successful in terms of growing the subscriber base since I committed to start doing those. So I hope you've all enjoyed those in addition to the RAXPODs. And I look forward to being back for the next RAXPOD at UFC 307 for Pereira versus Roundtree, which will be in about a little under a month. It looks like it's October 5th. But until then, we've got, I believe, only one other fight night to look forward to after that, which is kind of disappointing. We're going to have, it looks like after this upcoming event, we've got another week off, and then we will have Fight Night Moicano Santini, which will be interesting. Ronaldo's one of my favorites, obviously, but Benoit Santini's impressive in his own right, and it looks like there's a pretty healthy volume of fights on that card at this point, so that'll be a nice little return event after the break. But until then, thank you once again for tuning in. Hope you enjoy the pay-per-view as well as the return of American football, both collegiate and professional. But to the global MMA Rax audience, thank you very much once again for tuning in. And I'll be back for after the break with minute to winner breakdowns for Fight Night Moicano Benoit Saint-Denis, and then we'll be back on the RAXPOD for UFC 307. So take care, folks. Good luck.